I'd like to introduce her. I think lots of us know her. She's the director at the Estuary and Ocean Science Center, and she's been the science lead on many of the Coastal Conservancy's pilot Living Shorelines efforts, providing strong science, a positive attitude, and a willingness to work with many different partners on this work. So I just can't thank her enough for her contributions, and I'm glad she's sharing for the first time our 5 years of results from Giant Marsh.
Maybe I'll just hold this.
Either way, can you read that?
Yeah, so hopefully these slides will be bright enough for you guys to see, but yeah, so I'm at the Estuary and Ocean Science Center, but this is the work I'm going to show you today is a collaboration. Coastal Conservancy, the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center, Shayla Zabin leading that, Olafson Environmental, which is mostly Jeannie Hammond and her crew, and then ESA, which has been led by Damien Coots and Michelle Orr, and then USGS has been led by Susan Delacruz. So I think everybody knows basically what a living shoreline is. I don't think I need to spend time on this. Just an idea of restoration that enhances natural habitats while protecting shorelines instead of cutting them off, allowing for movement of organisms and materials, flexible movement of the shore over time, less costly, lots of good benefits. I can't talk about the Giant Marsh project without mentioning the Living Shorelines project at San Rafael. So I'm going to just first say a few things about that. So you can see the San Rafael project across the bay from the Giant Marsh project. San Rafael was 2012 and it was focused on oyster reefs and eelgrass. Go ahead. And so just to be sure everybody's on the same page here, we're talking about the Olympia oyster, and that's showing a tile with Olympia oysters on it, and we're talking about eelgrass, Saucer marina. At the San Rafael project, you can see the boat that's placing mounded bags of Pacific oyster shell is what we use for that project, and then you can see how we were planting the eelgrass, and then that's showing the two habitats together. Go ahead. And so it looks something like this along the shoreline. There were 4 large plots. They're about 30 meters by 10 meters, and they're either shellbag mounds by themselves, eelgrass by themselves, shellbag mounds plus eelgrass, or control that was just an open space. We also, if you can see that front line, there's a few different kinds of reefs that we tried just individually to see how they held up, how they attracted oysters. They weren't meant to do anything with physical processes. But I just want to point out there's only a single plot of each one, which was a large scale project at that time, but we scaled up from that for the Giant Marsh project to have more replication. So go ahead. We have some of our results in this book chapter that came out called Living Shorelines, which has a lot of different projects from around the country. But you know, some of the things that we found were millions of Olympia oysters coming, lots of different species. I mentioned the black oyster catcher earlier. People were saying what gets on reefs and reef balls. They're pretty rare. You can see the bay pipefish, economically important species like the Dungeness crab. Go ahead. We also found, ESA found that looking at, actually, was it PWA before that? And ESA, yeah. You can see this image where the reef structure, you can see larger waves, smaller waves on the shoreward side. They found about a 30% reduction by the reefs on the shore side at mean tide levels. And we also found in an experiment that eelgrass growth was improved if protected by the reef. Go ahead. We found also a greater, oh, my little video is working. So that's a sailor sea hare as scooching along an eelgrass blade. But we found a greater variety of species when the eelgrass was planted with oyster reefs. So this was an interesting finding about putting different kinds of habitats together in restoration. It was also an interesting project, and then we learned some things about extreme events because there were atmospheric rivers that came through in 2017. That's showing you the salinity there, and leading to a long low salinity period, which can wipe out some of our key species. This means that we might have to go back in and do restoration sometimes for eelgrass. The oysters will usually just come back in on their own. But it led us to a recommendation to spread restoration efforts in space and time as a sort of insurance against some of these extreme events. So that was a paper that Shayla led up recently. Go ahead. So all those different results informed our project at Giant Marsh. So we moved across the bay, not too far, still sort of Central Bay into San Pablo Bay. And the Giant Marsh project was constructed in 2019. You can see in that top image, we really were attempting at this point to look not just at the oyster reefs and the eelgrass, but to consider kind of the whole shoreline edge up in elevation all the way up to the terrestrial border. And so this is showing you kind of the large space that comprised all the different treatments from the offshore eelgrass and oyster reefs that you can see at the top on that right map, to all kinds of different things that we did closer to shore and in the marshes, and then all the way up to the terrestrial border. And so the first treatment I'll talk about is the offshore reefs and eelgrass. And so, as I mentioned, we didn't have replication of our treatments at the San Rafael site, so that we had an opportunity in this case to have 3 large oyster reefs with and without eelgrass, or with eelgrass planted either on the shoreward side or on the bayward side, with eelgrass also planted by itself, also replicated in 3 different patches. In addition, from the standpoint of the eelgrass, we planted it at 3 different densities. And we had never looked at different densities of plantings before. In fact, very few people have, but we did know that some other work that had planted at higher densities was very successful, like at Elkhorn Slough. So we had different patches that were planted at different densities. You can see the reef balls and bags of Pacific oyster shell that are on top of these, and that's what these arrays of reefs were made of, and then the eelgrass plantings next to them. So, gosh, there's so many results from this project. So we finished 5 years of the project in 2023. We found using flow dissolution, plaster dissolution blocks, that there was a reduction in wave energy by the reefs by about 36% near the reef to about 6% at about 16 meters shoreward. So this was along the same lines as what we had found at San Rafael. We have found a trend of organic carbon increasing in the eelgrass sediments when they're protected by the reefs. The eelgrass on the shore side benefited from the oyster reef protection again, like we had found before at San Rafael. The reefs led to significantly greater patch areas, even 20 meters shoreward of the reefs. We did find that higher planting densities led to greater densities and total shoots, but not in proportion to the numbers that we planted. So 4 times more shoots did not lead to 4 times ultimately more shoots, right? So, but there was a pattern of greater densities and patch sizes having planted at higher densities. So it's a trade-off there, right? It takes a lot more plants to plant at the high density. So you have to decide, is it worth it to you to have not that huge of an effect of that? We found the worst outcome for the eelgrass was when there were no reefs and low density plantings. So if you're planting eelgrass by itself, maybe you want to plant it a little bit more densely. Also, I wanted to point out that we did have to replant part of the site in the first year or the second year, because we had a heat wave in June, which we don't usually have, but you plant the plants and you have a heat wave and there's low tides and it just fries the plants. So, you know, you do have to think about that, and sometimes you have to react to that in these restoration projects. Invertebrates on and in the eelgrass, we had evidence of higher species richness, diversity, and abundance of the epifauna, that's the invertebrates on the plants, and the mobile invertebrates like crabs and shrimp in the reef-associated eelgrass compared to eelgrass grown alone. And then the oysters, there's a figure there with the oysters, they recruited well, densities were lower in wet years. So there is that interannual variability in how the oysters would do. And then fish, you know, we did a bunch of different techniques to try to understand fish use. Seining, trapping, eDNA, Eris sonar, they all had their issues. They also all had their benefits. And I won't get into those details right now. Together, if you can do all those different methods, you get a pretty good sense of what the fish assemblage is. It was a lot of work. So the next treatment to talk about is the effect of tidal elevation on native oysters. So if you can see that red circle around rows of individual reef elements, I don't know how well you can see that. It was to specifically try to understand as you go closer to the shore, how does that tidal elevation affect the oysters? And so the higher intertidal ones did not do as well. They suffered more losses. The deeper ones were more successful, and then lower on the reefs where it was wetter was also more successful. I mentioned this to some people out there. The fucus transplants that the Smithsonian did were pretty interesting too. This was to see if you can add a macroalgal canopy cover to try to add moisture and coolness, to support the oysters, that especially when they're up in the higher intertidal. The fucus is pretty, you can't really see it, but it's the rockweed, if you guys know these species. Pretty difficult to establish, but when it was successful, there were more oysters under the fucus. This is probably because it was slightly cooler and there's higher relative humidity. So it's an interesting technique to be thinking about for higher intertidal zones for oysters. Looking at birds, so this was USGS work, treatments 2 and 3. So the red circles around that same one, the 3 rows of reefs. And then there's a much larger reef, what we call the nearshore reef. And Susan Delacruz and her crowd found that water bird abundance increased significantly at low tide. If you can see the square rectangle around the reefs there, as opposed to when they're underneath the water. Dabbling ducks were most abundant when the reefs were partially exposed. Diving ducks more abundant when the reefs were nearly inundated. And then I just wanted to mention, I didn't mention the birds with treatment 1 because there weren't actually, they didn't find any effects of those treatments on bird use. Treatment 4 is Pacific cordgrass inshore from the big nearshore reef. And the question being, does the reef aid in plant establishment? And then treatment 5 is revegetation adjacent to existing Pacific cordgrass. So cordgrass that was out there already. Can you actually add cordgrass adjacent to it to improve the spread or the coverage of cordgrass? And then embedded in that were planting methods and the location along the shore. Okay. So this comes from Jeannie Hammond at OEI. You can see that they looked at 3 different treatments, so burlap or planting methods with burlap, with plugs, with sods. And I don't know if you guys can read this, but definitely found a much better effect of sods. And she noticed with the nearshore reef that not such a strong effect of the reef protecting the cordgrass, though Marilyn was telling me that it's really obvious when you're out there right now that there is some protection of that cordgrass. You can actually visibly see it. But from the data that she was able to look at for this, it didn't show that there was a protective effect. Sods survive the best. It confirms that cordgrass can survive at this site and do well when using the sods. There's really a rapidly eroding scarp at this site, and it's likely to need something else besides just planting with cordgrass to protect it. And then this was the treatment 5. This was planting of some large swaths of Pacific cordgrass using the bare root plugs versus sods. Again, sods, much higher survivorship than plugs. And then there was also some differences with the action of the blocks that were planted and how much they were exposed and how well the cordgrass did. But learned a lot about how to get cordgrass established. Then this is treatment 6. This is marsh, scarp, revegetation, and what we call arboring. And this is just some of the smaller green on the full length of the map there. Go ahead. And this is to test this concept of arboring. So this is something that Peter Bay came up with, looking at how pickleweed and we've talked about the California sea blight, the sueda, they and some other species of marsh plants will actually climb if you give them the opportunity to do so. And you can see this if there's a fence in the middle of the marsh or if there's a log, you'll see them climbing up and getting higher. So Peter had this idea that you could actually put branches into the marsh and encourage the marsh canopy to grow higher. Go ahead. Point of that is to provide refuge and cover during high tides and flooding. So this could be for the ridge-waste rail, it could be for the salt marsh harvest mounts. You can see a vole that's swimming away from the marsh as it's flooding there. So various mammals and birds could benefit from this potentially. And so we planted the California sea blight. It's really hard to get established at this site. We planted it repeatedly over and over again. It's a very high wave energy site. We learned that if we planted it with a little bit more of marsh in front of it, like pickleweed marsh in front of it, it helped a lot. So it was hard to keep it established, but where we did, we were able to see that placing arbors, so branches, eucalyptus branches in this case, led to the plants getting larger and also taller. We also did this in the existing pickleweed there, where we added these branches, and you can see the difference between the arbored pickleweed and not. So it really did work successfully to raise the canopy for both of those species. Go ahead. So this is just some overall takeaways. We found that adding reefs increased oyster populations. They attracted water birds at the shallower depths. They reduced the flow, the energy of the water, enhanced eelgrass, increased the diversity of the invertebrates in the eelgrass beds when the eelgrass was planted with the reefs. We found that testing the planting methods for multiple different marsh plants was really valuable to learning. I think we got a number of different lessons for cordgrass, pickleweed, and sweta. And one thing I didn't show you was about this transition zone into the terrestrial, which, we just didn't have time to show you data from that as well, but that's on a whole nother treatment that OEI did. We've learned quite a bit about how to plant these species successfully. We think it's really important to build experiments into these projects. We've done it, throughout this project. Really have learned a lot by actually doing that. We've learned that multiple restoration methods put together can synergize, and I was particularly pointing to the eelgrass benefiting from the oyster reefs, but the whole, one of our objectives for this project was to have a whole bunch of different methods, and we could see whether or not there was any benefit of doing those together. With interannual variability, like heat waves, like low salinity that comes from atmospheric rivers, we continue to think that spreading effort with a portfolio of restoration techniques, depths, timing, all these things can hedge bets, and maximize our success across the site or across San Francisco Bay. Also, we need to do the long-term monitoring so that we can understand patterns over time. If we looked at any of these results in a single year, we would have a different answer than if we looked at it over 5 years. These are all still very pilot scale treatments. This is a really large project compared to others that have been done around the estuary, but still very pilot scale. We really do need much larger projects in order to actually protect shores, right? And some of us were talking about when we walked out there, when you're thinking about when you're putting a reef in, how do you orient it? Do you orient it to the average wave condition and direction, or do you orient it to when the big storms are coming, which is not necessarily the same, right? And so we don't have very many projects yet that tell us the answer to that, like which way should you orient it? Should you have multiple reefs? Should you have, somebody said, should you have an L-shaped reef? Gosh, we don't know. So there is so much more that we need to learn, and we can only get there by doing these pilot scale projects. But to really understand shoreline protection with these projects, we're going to need to go bigger.